January 2021 saw the release of Dead Cell's next paid DLC, Fatal Falls. Like the previous DLC pack released for the game, it introduced new biomes, new items, a new boss fight, and new lore. For those interested in the story, the lore answers some of the long-standing questions of the series, but also raises new ones, creating enticing plot threads to be explored in the future. Let's take some time to take a stab at summarizing the new information and pose the new questions that have arisen from the information released in Fatal Falls. Out on the outskirts of the island is an amazing sight. Huge chunks of the earth float in the air, impaled by gigantic swords with snakes coiled around them. Having existed before the establishment of the kingdom on the island, construction of these fractured shrines were attributed to the ancients, likely the same people that constructed the sleeping sanctuary below Still Village. By the time of the king, the ancients had been long gone, so the understanding of how their shrines were constructed escaped the scholars of the realm. But despite the ancients' absence, their shrines weren't empty. There were people that called them home, people that were looked upon with suspicion by the royal court. This was due to the fact that the hooded and cloaked figures worshipped a religion born from foreign lands. As such, the king labeled them as pagans and cultists, and forbade his people from visiting the shrines. A decree which worked out, because the subjects of the kingdom had no desire to visit the pagans, who themselves didn't want visitors, going so far as to put up traps and hazards on the floating platforms of their home to ward off prospective guests. Thus, the two cultures developed in relative isolation from each other, a condition ripe for legends about the strangers to emerge. A particularly popular rumor in the kingdom centered on the queen, presumably the leader of the pagans, having immense treasure vaults full of gold and riches in the temples of the shrines. But since no one was brave enough to make their way to the fractured shrines, these rumors were relegated to legend, never to be confirmed. Although the cultists were able to isolate themselves from the realm, they weren't able to isolate themselves from events that affected more than just the realm, events that affected the entire island, events like the malaise. Although their isolation may have helped slow their downfall, inevitably, the pagans and cultists of the shrine became infected and transformed, populating their shrines with the monsters that covered the rest of the island. Included among these monsters, however, were creatures unlike anything else on the island, half-man, half-snake hybrids. While these creatures could have been products of the malaise, their similarities to the symbols of the religion that the cultists follow is interesting. It begs the question of whether it was a transformation of the malaise at all. Maybe it was some sort of religious ceremony that the cultists conducted, something connected to the power of the shrines and the ancients that created these hybrids. However, confirming this information would require knowledge and understanding into the ways of the pagans, which, given the isolation they had from the realm, isn't available, making these hybrids, much like the pagans as a whole, similar to the ancients they were possibly modeled after. A complete mystery. Past the home of the cultists of the fractured shrines was the rain-soaked coast of the island. It was formerly the home of smugglers, but they were pushed out when the king banished yet another group of people out of the realm, the group of scholars known as the apostates. The apostates used to be the healers or medicine men of the realm, who pursued higher knowledge by any means necessary. Any means necessary, including compromising accepted ethical standards in the pursuit of that knowledge. Due to that amoral drive, they were distrusted by many in the kingdom, despite their many accomplishments. This distrust came to a head when, for vague crimes against the crown, the king ordered his chief medical advisor to be put to death, and for the rest of the apostates to be banished to the shores at the edge of the realm. Whereas most people would look upon this sentence as punishment, for the apostates, it was a liberation, as they now had the freedom to perform their work without the judgmental attitudes of those that would impede their work for morals. The subjects of life and death were of particular interest for the apostates. The studies on life centered on blue cells that seemed to hold the potential to unlock numerous possibilities in humanity. But nothing had come from this work yet, and it was still being researched. The studies on death, however, had rapidly progressed, even shifting to the necromantic. They developed an item, a ferryman's lantern, that was capable of raising the dead to utilize them for a time for the user's own intentions, or harnessing the soul of one that was killed to use it as a weapon for a future attack. They may have even worked with the cultists of the fractured shrines to progress their experiments with death. In a shrine hidden behind invisible platforms lies a temple filled with blood and corpses. At its end is a vault which holds a sword named Serenade. The unique thing about this sword is that it's sentient, with a soul or mind imprinted upon the weapon. It's quite possible that the apostates, in their drive to further explore their mastery over death, chose one of the pagans, maybe a soldier or warrior, or perhaps the queen herself, and bestowed what remained of their life into the sword. The cultists, seeing one of their own be reborn in a form of a symbol they worshipped, could have come to revere the apostates, acknowledging their skills over death. Even if that's not specifically what happened, what is clear is that the cultists did respect the apostates, setting up statues to guard the domain of the scholars, which, given the necromantic dealings of its denizens, was now called the Undying Shores. Thus, when signs of a new illness began to manifest in the people of the kingdom, a sickness never seen by any of the current medical advisors, an ailment that was causing the bodies of the dead to rise where they fell, the apostates, who had a reputation for amoral experiments with death, and whose home was said to be filled with strange creatures, came to the mind of the king. He sent soldiers to their home to search for answers, who confirmed the conclusion he seemingly had already drawn in his mind, and sent back the information they found in the apostates' dwellings. This information didn't bring the wrath of the king down upon the apostates, but it did bring one of his vassals, the alchemist. Of similar mind and disposition as the apostates, the alchemist felt a kinship with them and was amazed at the work they'd done centering on death. In particular, he took note of their attempts to create a homunculus, an artificial human. The attempts of the apostates thus far had all failed to create a functional being, but where they had failed, the alchemist succeeded. Thanks to the notes of the apostates, along with the blue cells that was the cornerstone of their study, the alchemist was able to create a homunculus and successfully imprint the soul of the king, who had become infected with the malaise, which, by this point, had spread throughout the entire island, into it. But any hope that this method could be used to solve the problem of the malaise were dashed when he observed the effects of his work. The homunculus couldn't take a form of its own, so it was dependent on expired bodies in order to become a person. The homunculus retained no memories of its previous life, so had no context or framing with which to make their decisions. And the homunculus suffered from a loss of empathy, so lashed out violently to those around it. These results made using the homunculus method unviable as a cure to the malaise, but the work hadn't been in vain. It had introduced the alchemist to the blue cells, which would become fundamental in his work to create the panacea, the true cure to the malaise. And by creating the homunculus, which would later become the beheaded, he had a means to reliably collect more of the cells, thereby leading to the events and the climax of the story. Down in a ruined mausoleum past the Undying Shores, bright roses and large, bouncy mushrooms surrounded the dilapidated structure. Vegetation that evokes the memories of the grand gardens of the Arboretum of the kingdom. These plants are the result of a malaise monster that dwells within the ruined building named the Scarecrow, who, during their previous life as a world-famous botanist, had such an intense love for cultivation that it carried over into their afterlife. But as the details of the Scarecrow are noted and compiled together, their story begins to align with one that was thought to have ended. The story of the gardener, which seemed to conclude with their death in the prisoners' quarters. Obviously, that understanding was wrong, requiring a new, updated telling of their story. The gardener was a vassal of the king responsible for the arboretum, the royal gardens frequented by the nobles of the kingdom. When the malaise hit, the plants of the arboretum were affected as well, and the gardener conducted botanical experiments in an effort to understand the illness. At the same time, the king, afraid of the malaise and its rampant spread, ordered the arboretum burned to the ground. Obviously, the gardener protested such drastic action against their beloved greenhouses and blatantly defied the crown. It was this disregard for the authority of the king that likely led to their imprisonment. And this is where the story diverges. There's a prisoner that hanged themselves in the prisoners' quarters who is associated with various botanical items, hinting at their identity, leading to the presumption that this was the ultimate fate of the gardener, suicide at their own hand so they could control their own destiny. But there is a body of a man in the halls of the prisoners' quarters that throws a wrench in this conclusion. This man, lying in the halls before the arboretum, holds a key to the gardens and a note to the royal gardener threatening them to follow orders or they would meet a bad end. These items hint that this man could be the gardener, having been killed for ignoring these warnings. But they could have just been easily been held by a gardener who was meant to deliver the message to the gardener, an underling meant to deliver the letter to their boss. What really suggests this man is the gardener comes after his key is collected by the beheaded. His body disappears. Not itself alarming, it could have fallen victim to the rats of the prison or dragged off by a monster, but when combined with the next portion of the gardener's story, it becomes too noteworthy to ignore. While it's not clear how the gardener died, it is clear that they did die. But death wasn't the end for them, as before the end, they had become infected with the malaise. Thus, when life passed from their body, unlife filled it, and they rose again. However, unlike most, they still had their own mind, presumably thanks to some kind of botanical treatment of theirs, but they knew those treatments wouldn't be able to save them from their impending doom. So they set out on a journey across the island, hoping that somewhere there was a cure for the malaise. They first went to the fractured shrines, somewhere they had evidently been before, but was disappointed when no one recognized them. So turned their hopes to the apostates in the Undying Shores, praying that their amoral experiments had produced something that would help them. But alas, when they made it to the Undying Shores, they found the apostates in the throes of the sickness just like everyone else was. The gardener then started making their way to the lighthouse, the structure just off the coast of the Undying Shores, as a last resort for their cure. But the claws of their sickness had now dug too deep. So instead, they made their way to the crumbling Mausoleum, where they underwent their transformation and became the Scarecrow, where they spent the rest of their days, until their torment was finally ended by the one that, in life, was going to destroy their life's work. Which brings us to the end of the stories of Fatal Falls. The DLC offers a ton of information that fleshes out the background of the story of Dead Cells, as well as expanding on previously established stories. But that's not all it offers. There are various questions that arise as a result of the new information as well. Fatal Falls marks the first time that a queen is mentioned in the lore. Is this queen merely the leader of the pagans, or is she actually related to the royal family, like a sister, aunt, mother, cousin, or wife? Could she be a part of a distant branch of the royal family that's trying to usurp the king's hold on his kingdom? The possibilities seem limitless and incredibly enticing. Then we come to the lighthouse, seen in the waters off the coast of the Undying Shores. It obviously holds some importance or significance, as the gardener's message isn't the only mention of the structure. The mausoleum that the Scarecrow inhabits houses a large, stained glass relief of what looks to be a homunculus bordered by smaller windows of that lighthouse. It's quite possible that some people were making journeys there, as there are some ruined ships or boats scattered in the waters around the lighthouse, and there are half-finished ships and caves of the Undying Shores. Maybe that's where the apostates went when they tried to make a homunculus. Maybe that's where smugglers went to take survivors off the island. But what exactly is so important about that building remains to be seen. Hopefully, these questions and much more will be answered in the future by another content pack, but we'll just have to patiently wait for that day to arrive. As for now, I think I got everything, but may have missed something or interpreted it incorrectly, so feel free to point out anything that I missed. Additionally, if you have any questions, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, thank you for watching and see you later.